So I see we've got quite a few people on today's webinar. We seem to be nice and core. So perhaps we're kick off now and do some introductions. So my name's Ben Godfrey. I'm the Director of the Distribution System Operator for National Grid Electricity Distribution, and I'm joined today by Matt. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Matt Watson. I work for Ben in the flexibility team at National Grid Electricity Distribution. Yeah.
Excellent. And today we've got a webinar explaining our evolution of our flexibility services to give you a bit of a deeper understanding of the changes that we're making across how we're engaging with the market and flexibility, really to try and make the market richer and deeper, but also provide more opportunities for participation and reduce some of those barriers as well. So within today's webinar, a brief outline of some of the items. Really, we want to explain the changes that we're making behind the scene, explain some of the new products that we're bringing forward into delivery, explain the timescales that are associated with that, and then provide a vision of the future on how we're going to be integrating with wider markets, platforms, and kind of underlying processes, particularly with a view around ESO coordination. So in terms of who we are National Grid Electricity Distribution, formerly known as Western Power Distribution. So we cover the Midlands, Southwest and South Wales of the UK. We're very much committed to being at the heart of the energy system transformation and delivering that clean, fair and affordable energy future to all of our 8 million customers. We've been undertaking lots of provision of flexibility services and really delivering that flexibility a first approach since 2017, when we first made that initial commitment. Last year we published our first evolution of flexibility services document, which explains some of the changes, and we're now updating you with some of the developments that we've made off the back of that and bringing forward some of those propositions that we first highlighted in our previous document. And then in terms of today's webinar, really this is one of the main focus points for us to engage with our providers and our wider stakeholders, making sure that our products and processes are fit for purpose, that we're hearing and responding to that feedback, and also that we're developing new ways of improving how we can interact with those flexibility service providers and other stakeholders, increasing that market liquidity and competition. That's going to be really crucial for driving forward the biggest benefit from flexibility services. So we've got a number of specific questions that we are really seeking some guidance on. Some of those we have minded to positions, others we're a bit more open and trying to understand exactly where we think it should go. So some nice frank feedback would be really appreciated. The supporting document for this is available on our website, and we're uploading a recording of this webinar later on as well. There are two workshops, as I sort of mentioned earlier on the 29th and also on the 5th of December, and they're aimed to be deep dive sessions where we can really gather specific feedback on there. But in any eventuality, you can also submit feedback via the online form, and we're really trying to go and get that feedback by the 9th of December. So in terms of our stakeholder engagement process, then the consultation comprises of two stages: an informal engagement in November and December, followed by a more formal consultation into the new year. The launch of the new flexibility products will mean that we're going to have extensive engagement with the providers in the new year. The more formal consultation, we're minded now to drop that. We think that the informal and the formal routes, whilst they have specific purposes, we think that they're a bit duplicative this year. So we're minded to drop the more formal consultation and use these informal sessions as the main route in. But again, really keen to see to seek your feedback. Do you appreciate a much more lighter touch from the informal sessions going forward to something that's more formalised, or do you think that this is sufficiently formal to really gauge that opinion? So very keen on hearing your feedback on those two questions. So now I'd like to hand over to Matt, who's going to walk us through some of the new products that we'll be looking to deliver.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. And I think, as you mentioned, the real emphasis on this is, the point of this evolution process is to get your feedback on what we're doing. So in addition, obviously the first question is about how we collect that feedback. We want to make sure that this is as useful to you as possible, that we can kind of collect things in a clear and concise way and don't kind of create too much burden on either side. So please do kind of get in contact with all these. It's worth noting that the specific questions are covered in the evolution document itself. They'll also be covered more specifically in the workshops we've got over the coming weeks. Today is going to be a bit more of here's a bit of an explanation of what we're trying to do, maybe time to capture a few questions at the end, but really just kind of get you sort of thinking about where we are, give a bit more context, and then kind of give you space after this event to try and kind of provide feedback. But please do kind of contact us in however way possible to try and kind of do this, because we are really keen to kind of make sure this is as useful to you as possible. So as Ben said, I've got the first section on some of the new product delivery. So the background behind this is that last year we suggested a number of changes to how we procure flexibility services. Most of those are sort of nearing fruition, so we're looking to deploy a lot of them in the new year. And actually, there are a few questions that have come up as we've kind of got into the more details of deployment that we want to kind of ask about. Many have sort of minded to positions because we do need to kind of be able to take things forward in the short run, but we are very keen on kind of understanding whether those work, whether they should be adjusted, and then kind of feeding them into our delivery plan. So the first area of kind of discussion we wanted to kind of bring up was around our sustain product. So we're developing the sustain product to be a kind of a simplified scheduled active power service. So the aim is that it's much sort of simpler to participate in, slightly less technical, less targeted off the back of it. But the kind of the point here is to kind of provide a simplified route to market and see whether that is attractive to providers. It came off the back of our Sustain H trial, as there was an innovation project. It has a number of kind of key benefits around kind of, just the simplicity in terms of what our requirements are. So having quite fixed windows, having simplified requirements around metering, so allowing half-hourly metering, kind of this is very much sort of focused at kind of trying to enable domestic assets. And then we're also looking to kind of use this to manage beyond just the sort of zones on our EHV network, which we currently use our current products for. We're also going to try and use this to kind of both simplify the requirements from a provider perspective, but also allow us to manage sort of lower down on our network on the HVLV boundary. So we're very keen to kind of roll this out. But one of the questions that we kind of looked at around this is just around kind of how we package up our requirements. So in the original trial for Sustain H, we had all our requirements packaged up into one big zone, and this was done to try and simplify the upfront kind of interactions with providers, to try and reduce the number of interactions and see if that could make things more accessible. Off the back of that trial, we actually had some feedback to say, well, actually that's useful, but actually one of the things it does is it sort of kind of softens some of the price signals. So there was a kind of push to try and break it up into 3 zones where you can have a higher, medium and low prices, so that where we have higher price signals in certain areas, that can actually be passed through to customers, which we think is very sensible. But one thing that we've kind of been looking through as we kind of deploy is trying to understand whether that is still as simple as we think it would be. So one of the challenges we have around this is that ultimately, if we package this up in sort of aggregate groups to providers, that kind of simplifies the initial interaction. But ultimately, the value to National Grid remains at an individual zonal level. And so you have challenges in the kind of sort of disaggregation and reaggregation of responses in terms of providers, especially if we have sort of different levels of response in different zones. So if we have a collection of multiple zones, some where we have an oversubscription of requirements, some where we have an undersubscription of requirements, we might want to accept bits of them, reject other elements of that, and trying to do that and then reaggregate those becomes quite complex. You end up having to try and almost sort of partially accept people's offers. And so we want to open the questions to work out whether actually it would be simpler just to publish our requirements on an individual zone or basis. So this would mean that there are more zones up front. So there's potential additional complexity up front, but it would allow us to be a lot clearer and simpler in sort of then the follow-up processes to go, well, actually, these are our requirements. This is the volume you got off the back of it. There is or isn't competition in that area, and here's a price that's come off the back of it, and it would allow us to become a lot clearer in that what that process is. But obviously, it does have upfront costs. Now, we're doing what we can to minimize those costs. So we're doing a lot of work to try and digitize a lot of this process. So we hope that that kind of offsets this additional workload, but it's something we're very keen to talk to you about what is the right kind of balance of this, and how do we genuinely make this a simple product, and really considering the whole life cycle of the product rather than potentially just focusing on the initial engagement. So that's kind of what we're talking about around sustain. We've also got some work we're doing on secure and dynamic and pricing. So for those, just as a kind of a quick recap, to date we've predominantly used fixed prices with that are common across all our zones, with the option to kind of bring in competition where we have sufficient liquidity. We've been doing a review of how those pricing work, how those prices are set, because ultimately they haven't really changed since we started procuring flexibility. And one of the things we're very keen to do is to start sort of introducing ceiling prices. So this is introducing individual prices maximum prices per zone that reflect the true cost or the true value of that flexibility to us. So looking at the value of the specific asset deferred, looking at the volumes we require, and providing effectively a price cap to what we're willing to pay on a per zonal level. And we hope this can provide additional value into the market and a much more targeted view of where the sort of value is for us. We'll be doing that by pulling data out of the common evaluation methodology, which is sort of the common tool for valuing flexibility across DNOs, which has a few limitations in how it works. But what we're effectively looking to do is provide a sort of a ceiling price based on a sort of an effective, sort of an equivalent utilization rate. So understanding that, say, if you have a zone where we need 10 units of utilization and 100 units of availability, one effective unit of utilization would be effectively one unit of utilization and 10 availability, pull together a total cost and kind of use that to value the zones. We'd be looking for providers then to respond to us with a utilization price. We'd be looking to fix the ratio between utilization and availability. So if you provide us with a utilization price, we can calculate the availability price and then look to use a pay as clear mechanism if we have sufficient liquidity in the zone. We'd like to move to a place where we can actually sort of remove that fixed ratio between availability and utilization, but that's something we don't have the systems to do at the start. But we thought it's better to kind of bring out ceiling prices and start to kind of release that value, and then we'll improve as we kind of move forward. The other bit that's worth noting is that if you're calculating ceiling prices, then the viability or not of a zone becomes a little bit harder to come out of that sort of CEM methodology. Effectively, everything becomes viable, but it just depends on what price. And what we want to do is introduce this concept of a minimum value threshold, which is basically saying we only want to put zones out to the market where there is actually a chance of people participating. So if the price comes out very low, what we don't want to do is kind of publish that out, because it takes additional effort from our side. It puts additional effort on your side to read those results and then decide that they aren't viable. And so we want to kind of put a threshold at the bottom to say below this, it isn't worth putting out to the market. But we really do want to engage with you on how we set that value. So this is about, not flooding you with information and with zones that have minimum kind of chance of success, but allowing you to focus on the areas where we actually have genuine tangible value. And so I'm very keen to engage. We've got a few minded to values to kind of enable us to get through the sort of first iteration of this, but very keen on understanding how we should set these values. This is, the aim here is to continue to be transparent and put things out to market. We just, effectively want to put a bound on it so we don't end up publishing things that are silly. So there are some questions in there around kind of how we do this and how we should be setting those prices. If that's the sort of pricing for secure and dynamic, then we also want to have a look at the pricing for restore. So restore is our kind of It's often seen as a bit of a secondary service in a lot of our zones, and it's basically the counterfactual against it is not about reinforcement deferral, but it's about restoring customers. Again, it was previously set as kind of a multiple of the utilization price of the sort of main service prices, but effectively what we want to do now is kind of review that pricing and tie it back to the true value to National Grid. So we want to tie it to the value of a customer minute lost. So this is kind of one of the metrics, or this is one of the incentives we have for restoring customers. Because that's the counterfactual, we want to kind of tie it into that. We can't provide you with firm numbers as to exactly where it will be at the moment, because we're waiting for our final determinations to understand exactly what the value of a CML will be going forward. But ultimately, we want to tie it to that. We want to have a common price across all license areas, and keep it tied to the value of those customer minutes lost. So we have a very clear use case internally. Another thing we're talking about, and I think with this, I'm realizing there is an awful lot that we are covering. There's multiple different things we're jumping across. The point of this is just to give a bit of an overview. Please do kind of use this to then go back into the documents, work out what we're doing, and kind of, come prepared to the workshops to really tell us what you think about all of this. But one of the things we're looking at, we're also looking at about kind of what metering we support. So traditionally, we've only accepted minute by minute metering for all our services. As we mentioned, for the sustain service, we are now effectively allowing half-hourly metering. That was done to, again, ease a sort of widen access, but was also accompanied by a fair amount of statistical analysis to make sure that we weren't kind of losing any value along the way. And it was very much targeted to certain asset types. So generally domestic assets like electric vehicles, heat pumps. And we've taken this as an opportunity to review the suitability of a number of our services. And we see it as a bit of a matrix between the suitability of the service and the assets that are participating. So some services are probably better suited. So our secure services tends to be scheduled a bit further out, tends to run on for half hours, so it's a bit better suited. Our dynamic product is inherently quite reactive, so could be dispatched off the half hour, which point half-hourly metering becomes quite awkward. And so we've got to pull this together, this matrix, and effectively what we're trying to do is to kind of allow where we can and kind of manage things sensibly. So we are going to allow half-hourly metering for domestic assets in the secure program. And then hopefully that kind of makes that more accessible. Then we'll see how that rolls out. And then, so another area we're then looking at is understanding how we can try and maximize the value of energy storage. So we are fully aware that the point of storage is that it's inherently very flexible technology. The whole point of it is you have it brings flexibility onto the network with potential significant value to the network and the broader system. But we're also aware that in terms of kind of how we often assess connections, we can actually make access to the network significantly more challenging because of the way we model. So we tend to model for what an asset could do. So what's the kind of worst case scenario, what could it do, which kind of then actually sees some of these assets actually contributing to limitations on the network rather than alleviating them. Now, we want to work through this and try and build in processes to kind of stop this from happening and to better understand how energy storage will work, and also how we can contract with them to, release that flexibility that they inherently have. I think we're kind of aware that sort of a lot of these sites are quite, technically flexible, but the big limitation is around how they sort of revenue stack, how they are financed, because ultimately, if we're using flexibility, then you're taking that flexibility away from other markets, and obviously there is a cost. So a lot of what we're trying to do is think about the loss of opportunity and how can we sort of minimize this so that we can genuinely contract with storage in an effective way that is beneficial to all parties. So we've put some ideas about how we think we could do this, and again, very keen to discuss with people kind of how this could work. But we're suggesting using our secure product, which is kind of has a bigger focus on availability fees. So acknowledging that, again, probably the core cost to any storage provider is the loss of opportunity from other sites rather than the marginal running costs. So trying to kind of reflect that in the way we would be doing this. Looking to use slightly longer contracts to allow us to help us manage the risk on our network to kind of actually release capacity off the back of these contracts. And I think potentially the biggest thing is trying to really align what we're doing with our planning assumptions. So effectively, you know, a lot of the limitations we think here are to with, you know, the way in which we're planning, which, you know, are sensible because we do have to manage the risk that could happen to the network. But if we can kind of feed that into the way we baseline different sites, then actually we can then put in contracts in place to manage against that risk, and therefore allow us to plan in a slightly different way. So the aim would be to kind of tie into those assumptions, and actually they are generally quite pessimistic. So we will often model storage at peak import at times of peak demand. And so actually anything that a storage site is to not be doing that is a benefit. And whilst we acknowledge this could potentially, you know, is potentially quite generous compared to if you were kind of using more sort of operationally based sort of baselining, we feel that this helps us manage the planning risk, because this is all about us managing risk. And actually, if it is a relatively low cost piece for storage providers to do, then that should be reflected in price. And we're really kind of trying to work against, you know, understanding against that baseline planning assumption. So if we're assuming that something would be at full import at a certain point in time, even a provider, you know, guaranteeing us that they might only be at, you know, maximum half of their full import capacity, would provide capacity back onto the network that we could use to connect broader customers. And so we're really interested in how we build this proposition so that it kind of provides us with the risk management we want without unduly limiting your access to other markets. And we're really interested in having some discussions about exactly how that might operate. I think we're getting towards the end of my, so yeah, I've got two more elements to do before I kind of pass back to Ben. So we also have some questions in our piece around asset duplication. So this is trying to understand kind of what we do if multiple parties claim the same asset. We haven't seen this too much at this stage, but we've kind of, you know, it's been identified in a number of trials as a potential risk. So we're trying to start to think about how we would build in processes to manage this, and especially manage this at scale. So if we get into a world where we are contracted with multiple providers who are controlling assets at a domestic level, then we need processes that can scale and can manage this risk sensibly. And so we're interested in understanding, you know, kind of what are the scenarios where asset duplication is genuinely a risk? What are the areas where actually we just need to be able to have processes that are, you know, capable of sort of facilitating this, and what do we need to do around that? So, for example, if you have an asset that is operated by one aggregator for a period of time, then moves to another aggregator, then that's perfectly fine. We should be able to accommodate that within our systems. But if you have two aggregators trying to provide the same asset to us, we need to work out what we do. And we think this is kind of, our solution is to kind of cover a few different questions. So trying to really kind of drill down into when an asset is genuine, when a conflict is genuinely there. So do you identify a conflict just when two kind of providers try and pre-qualify the same asset? Is it only when they're actually kind of committing to a trade for you? There's a question around what the resolution process is. So is it, you know, do you just give it to the first come, first serve? Do you get the aggregators to discuss amongst themselves until they can work out who owns it? Do you go back to the asset owner? There's a number of different options that you could be doing in there, and we're really keen to get your views on that. And then there's also a process of what you do whilst you're doing that resolution. So some of them will be relatively instantaneous, so this becomes a sort of more of a moot point. But if you are asking providers to work out, to come back to you about who owns the asset, how do we create processes that give them the right incentives to resolve that in a timely manner? So lots of questions in there. We're really keen to kind of start discussing with this. We acknowledge that this one in particular is something that we're not going to be able to solve ourselves as National Grid electricity distribution. We're very keen that this sort of starts a conversation we can then extend to broader DNOs and with the ESO to come up with a sort of more industry standard around this, because it makes sense that if we've got that the process should be common across all providers. So very keen to sort of start this discussion, and this will sort of feed into some of the systems that we're building in terms of kind of building additional capacity. And then the final topic I wanted to pick up before we pass over to Ben around kind of delivery is around kind of how we manage trades, and basically how do we put out our requirements to providers and can then select providers off the back of it. And this is something that we've been kind of thinking a little bit about kind of how do we kind of do this in the clearest and best way. We sort of see two general broad approaches to how we would do this. So at one of the end of the spectrum, you could try and simplify our requirements to try and make the process for putting requirements out and clearing against them as simple as possible. So effectively, by kind of taking our requirements and kind of creating this a sort of kind of a worst case position across them, so taking our peak requirement and kind of the requirements over, so both for capacity and availability, you could simplify our requirements and just ask providers, are you able to provide capacity for the entirety of our requirement and for a certain volume, and what price? And then effectively you could have a pretty simple price stack that you would be able to clear against. And that has a level of appeal because it allows us to kind of clear things in a very simple way, a very transparent and obvious way. But the challenge is that then to do that, you're kind of having to, while still managing our network thing, you're having to kind of procure significantly more megawatt hours than you would if you were kind of doing things in a more targeted way. And so you have a direct impact on the value you can do per unit of utilization that we're procuring. So at the other end of the spectrum, you then potentially go, well, actually, we know what our requirements are. They are these complex profiles of need. And actually what we can try and do is kind of get providers to tell us exactly what they're capable of doing when we then try and sort of play a little bit of Tetris to try and work out how we fulfill those requirements in the most effective way, and then come back with providers and say, this is effectively what we need. This was, say, the highest cost that we used in matching that, and that's what's going to sort of set your clearing price. Now, obviously the positive of this is you're then kind of much more targeted in terms of what your requirements are, but the sort of downside to that is that this matching is potentially significantly more complex, and therefore trying to be clear and transparent on how you're doing that becomes more challenging. And so within these two options, effectively, we've kind of got these two pieces. I think we're very much on the minded to position that we prefer to go for the latter, where we're trying to sort of really kind of match to our requirements. And this is primarily due to that value question. We know that we need to ensure there is value to our services. We don't want to do anything that will erode that value. And we also acknowledge that over time, we can then try and, to deploy this initially, it's going to be quite a manual process, but we can then look to build out better capabilities so that we can kind of, better effective optimization capabilities around this that we can then publish and work with you. So we are looking over time or next year to start to put us a tender out to try and bring appoint a strategic partner to help us in this topic, but we will very much be pushing down that how do we match our requirements as effectively as possible, because that's where we see is the way of kind of providing the most value out of this. But again, really keen on your views to kind of understand whether you think that is sensible. So I'll pause there and hand over to Ben, who's going to talk about the delivery plan.
Thanks, Matt. A great introduction there to a number of different topics that we're sort of seeking views on. And again, this is really important because not only are we trying to build those rich and deeper markets and remove the barriers and address some of the feedback that we've had from some of our flexibility stakeholders, but we're also trying to make sure that we've got the right technical building blocks that we can use flexibility within our network to really achieve good outcomes for our customers. And then we're also seeking to use those flexibility in real life network and system development. So uniquely, because we've got a ring-fenced DSO function now that is responsible for the system planning functions and the flexibility market development and operation, then we can pull those things together and make sure that we've got the right building blocks to address the development needs. So as our network grows out, we can use a combination of wires and non-wire solutions in the most efficient way. So we really are very much, keen on taking these forwards as soon as we can, and so definitely doubling down on equipment to do things with the information that you provide. And bringing on to the theme of delivery, then just a quick snapshot here of our delivery plan that we've got for this. So this is built off the back of our previous evolution paper, where we sort of set out that we're going to be making some of these changes. We've been busy in the background actually planning out the delivery and speccing out some of the systems and processes that are going to be needing. We're very much in that system build phase at the moment, and then we're expecting the signposting of the share trade needs to go out at the beginning of next year, when we traditionally go out for our kind of 6-monthly tender information, releasing the system needs out to the wider audience. And then we've got a systematic process for looking at the other elements that need building out, really with a view that towards the end of next year, just ahead of the winter period, we'll have the systems in place in order to be able to go to this traded capability and really use these services in anger that would much better solve some of the network constraints and limits that we've got on our network that can be deferred or avoided using this flexibility approach. In terms of next steps as well, then we want to give a further view on the platforms and processes that we're going to be looking at, and give a wider view on how we see those evolving. So really our platforms and processes, we've got two main focuses really. One is about this common overarching platforms, so that both ESO and DSO, all system operators, have a converged route to be able to access services, albeit regarding that there's going to be lots of different marketplaces and exchanges that are going to be available and going to be providing some of the flexibility. So although we want a convergent route for accessing this from the system operators, we expect there to be a real fervent ecosystem of marketplaces and exchanges to be able to facilitate that. And that will also include aggregators and suppliers as well, whether they want to choosing a different route that's going to best suit their purpose. And so because there's quite a lot of expected change on there, we think the second big focus in enabling that overarching convergence and effectively convergence between the system operators, we think that is best supported by a common data layer and common interfaces. And that is something that we believe that we can drive forward as an industry, with reasonable pace in the short term and very low regret investments, in terms of making sure that standardization occurs fairly quickly. So we think that the best approach really is this decentralized and modular architecture that will be built on a number of specific links that are standardized across a number of different functions and elements of flexibility, and those will be supported and delivered by third parties. But by having that crucial common data layer and the standardization of those data interfaces, we can do that much more with a much quicker pace. And there are a number of different key areas where we see that there is some natural areas where the DSO is already taking a lead on and has a natural remit for developing those systems out much more quickly. And there are other interface systems that we think need to be developed as an industry and taken forward with the support from third parties and marketplaces. And then there's also a layer where we think that the platforms and processes, where the processes will be developed by the market to be integrated within platforms. And we've set out a number of our thinking within the evolution paper that we'd really like some further feedback on. Basically, where there are some elements that we think are most applicable for DSOs to be able to provide information, particularly around that kind of identification of system needs and signposting. So explaining to the market what is needed and where. But there are other areas where we believe that the market is very much more best placed to be able to support and delivery of those particular activities. So something like trade selection and matching needs, that is something where the market can step in and help support delivery of that outside of the DSOs. There are other elements where we think that there is some value, but perhaps there's more commonality. So things like settlement reporting, perhaps that there would there be elements that be better taken forward as an industry. I think we'd really like to seek views about where we think these processes and elements can fit into the kind of ecosystem of flexibility. And then crucially underpinning all of that is a standardized interface data layer that is able to tie all these things together and enable DSOs and marketplaces to talk the same layer. I think getting those things in place with strategic partners is very much our goal and our focus over the next few months. I'd like to hand back now to Matt, who's going to go and talk a little bit more about the ESO coordination and the next steps and wrap up of the webinar.
Thanks. And I think on that platforms and process piece, I think it's really important to kind of, we've identified a number of kind of functions that need to happen. We've said that some might need to functionally live within the DSO, some as interfaces, some in the market, but we are really open as to kind of who we engage with on all those. So just because some of those might live within the DSO doesn't mean we can't bring in sort of, the best capabilities from out there in the market to support this. So whilst there are things that live in different places, we're really interested to understand how we can develop capabilities and what should go where. So really interested in discussion with that. I will again just kind of push you to kind of, if you've got any questions, please do throw them into the Q&A. We will have a short time for Q&A at the end of this webinar. So yeah, if you do have any questions, do drop them down. But yeah, so the final section that I was going to pick up was around kind of ESO coordination. So I think you'll notice in the document that we go from quite specific questions, very targeted questions, to kind of broader and broader as we go through the document. And this is probably one that's kind of at that broader kind of end of the spectrum. And it's just talking about kind of how might we best coordinate with the ESO. And I think it was just trying to take a bit of a kind of stock of where we are and how we're already doing that. So, we're already doing a lot of work to try and coordinate with the ESO. We are trying to work to build our services as stackable as possible. We're doing work through the NA around primacy. So there's lots of work that's already happening. But I think one of the bits that we're interested about kind of how this is structured. Because I think we sort of see two broadly different models that could happen with a kind of direction in the market there where we kind of see where things are going. So at one end of the spectrum, you see a world where effectively you kind of have a kind of clear view on products. So each system operator effectively kind of defines their requirements as tightly as possible. So, I have a requirement in a specific way, I define it as tightly as possible, put it out to the market and kind of tell people exactly what the value is, when our requirements are, how to fulfill that. And we'll all put out multiple different requirements, and then it very much sits on the flexibility service provider to then work out how to optimize their revenues against all those different requirements. It puts kind of that complexity onto the flexibility service provider, and anything to do with then it's very much up to them to manage how they sort of stack revenues across things. And any primacy sort of rules that we're looking at kind of have to kind of flow around that loop as well, because they are the sort of FSP is kind of the key person there in terms of kind of working out how value is kind of sourced. At the other end of the spectrum, you have this world where we're probably in a more sort of services workplace view of the world. And this is kind of looking at, a view where actually instead of the system operators kind of specifying exactly what they want, it's more about providers telling system operators what they can do, and then the system operators coming back and going, well, actually these are what I need to hit our requirements. And so it kind of flips the way in which some of this works, and has a very different kind of focus, with potentially more of the complexity on the system operator side between us and the ESO to work out how we manage our different requirements, how you manage primacy. And so we kind of see these two different views of the world and different models. And I think we'd kind of suggest that at this stage, we're probably more, we see most of our products, things being more of a product kind of based world. So most of the new ESO requirements come out as quite tightly defined products. A lot of our requirements are pushing down products. So we see a kind of a clear value in that direction, but we just wanted to kind of take a step back and just ask the question as to whether we're clear that is, as to whether there's kind of value in this alternative route. I think we see it, especially on the DNS side, it's quite difficult to mix the two. There's kind of clear value in there, especially kind of given where we are. So we want to kind of have this question about what is potentially the right direction. Could things potentially be easier for participants if we took a more service-based route? And so this is quite an open question. In the short term, because most of the things are in a productized view of the world, that is kind of where we're moving forward by default. We don't want to kind of have this question delay our progress, but we are interested to see whether people have a different view. And whilst we said most of the ESO kind of requirements are in that sort of product style view of the world, I think the big kind of counter to that might be the balancing mechanism, which is more of this sort of service-based world where people put requirements out and it covers a sort of a number of different ESO requirements. And given all the work that ESO is doing to try and widen access to that, we kind of want to understand how that works. And this is really about trying to understand what is the best way of doing coordination. So inherently, we have to coordinate to have an effective kind of way of managing the whole system. We need to coordinate between ourselves and the ESO, and being clear on what that would be is really important. Our GammaFlex project, innovation project, had a look at sort of this more service-based view of the world from a kind of a distribution perspective. It came out with some interesting findings about kind of some of the on there, but we're very interested in kind of how this works. And again, with all this is kind of, quite early kind of high level models. There's a lot of kind of, nuance in there that we're very keen to discuss to kind of see whether, these models are actually, work. Are they potentially a bit overly simplistic? And it's more about trying to understand what kind of next steps might be. If you were to try and push to a more service-based view of the world, we would have to kind of have more discussions with the ESO to kind of see how this might progress. But very interested in getting your views on that. And it's worth mentioning, that all of this, it's all about trying to, work out how do we most effectively stack value for providers, make it easiest for them to participate, and kind of balance the sort of levels of complexity on each side so we can get the right outcome. So that covers our content. I think there is a lot that we've covered in the last 45 minutes. The real big push is to kind of say that, there's full information of this in the evolution document. We will be uploading the recording of this webinar. We can upload the slides as well. We're keen on your feedback. Either we'd love to see you at the workshops so we can discuss this in more detail. Those will be slightly longer sessions with less of us presenting. They're broken down into the two broad sections. So the first one is very much on the products, so the kind of more detail, and the second one is on sort of the platforms, processes, and coordination. And we wanted to kind of break it up because we thought different people might be interested in different bits. We're very keen to discuss both, but also provide feedback through this. We've got an online form. We've got, if you want to email us, please do get in contact. We do want to kind of get your thoughts on all this. So yes, so I think that's where we go. We've got a couple of questions. Right, Ben, have you had a look at them, or do I need to read them before I start sharing them? Or...
No, both excellent questions. So the first question we've got there is very much about that ESO and DSO coordination, and how do we understand the risk that our networks are currently subjected to when we're talking about sort of changing loads, particularly us with the intermittency of renewables, or indeed the changing load profiles of demand. So how is that risk currently assessed, and how achievable is it, how realistic is it that there can be a kind of common framework across DSOs and ESOs to identify the risk in a particular way, and then ensure that there's a common way of providing transparency of the risk and mitigating and coordinating that risk together across ESO and DSO. So perhaps, Matt, you can try now, have a go answering that.
honestly, I was reading the follow-up questions, so I'm gonna assume. Yeah,
I can go for it again, as it is an excellent question. I think the risk of running networks, particularly secure networks with flexibility services, is something that the ESO certainly has a lot more experience of, really with balancing supply and demand. And so they've got a particular framework and security standards that allow flexibility and operational actions to play a more coordinated part in providing that security. It's an area that DNOs and DSOs are just evolving into at the moment, but we've got some really good experience with how that's running at the moment. And I think it definitely is achievable, that both of us can identify the likelihood and the absolute amount of risk that our network would be exposed to if flexibility services weren't there, and then again how those flexibility services can be used and stacked together to be able to mitigate the risk on both DSO and ESO. So it very much is achievable, and it's something that it definitely needs to happen. I think it will be very much an evolution of improving some of our standards to acknowledge and be supported by flexibility services, but certainly taking that forward with both ESO and DSO together is the right step. So the SQSS and the P2 that we both transmission and distribution work to respectively need to be coming together a little bit more keenly, particularly with respect to flexibility services.
Thanks, Ben. And we've got two follow-up questions that are nice and interesting. So the first one is just around the accessibility of these new flexibility products, for whether they're just for connected demands or for new demand connections or for connected demands. So I think, with all our flexibility products, we want them to be accessible to effectively all participants, all people that are already connected to our network. This is, with a lot of the work we're doing on flexibility services, about saying, well, you have certain access rights to our network. Can we kind of manage your access to that with that to help kind of broaden or allow us to run the network more efficiently? That's kind of very much the core of what we're doing. We want to make this as accessible to all. There's often a differentiation between, flexibility services tend to be around, it's like, well, there's a lot of discussion, obviously with the significant code review around access rights, and that tends to be, what can you do to, and what your kind of default ability to access the network, and then flexibility services then about saying within that, can we manage you more effectively? We do want all this to be kind of as accessible to different providers as possible. And if there are things that we're doing that make it potentially harder for certain people to provide, please do kind of let us know. That is, we want to kind of make it as wide as possible.
And then, I think picking up on that point, Matt, around the sort of flexibility services and how do they sit alongside the access rights. As you say, they're very much voluntary flexibility services, and it's something that's commercially agreed between parties. But crucially, it isn't enduring, so that there is a fixed period of time about when the expectation is that you need to undertake that service, and outside of that, it clearly doesn't have any remit, and we'd expect those flexibility services to be fixed length in time. And I think that's the interesting part, is that flexibility services, the extent to which people participate in those in particular areas will ebb and flow depending on the network need. So if the network becomes more constrained, we'll expect more flexibility services to be needed. If the network becomes less constrained, then obviously they can go. Whereas the network access arrangements, particularly around flexible connections, they will be enduring and contractually upheld through connection agreements, which are very much for the lifetime of the connection.
Right, and then we've got a question around kind of interfaces and whether these will be standard across all DSOs or just NGET. And I think this is really, so I think, you know, we would definitely like to get to a position where everything is standard across all DSOs, and actually tied that to the ESO. You know, the more we can standardize, the better. I think the question is just how we get to that piece. You know, for a number of these things, actually, we have requirements where actually we want to be able to kind of digitize some of our processes now where there aren't standards. And so it's going to be a little bit of a, you know, we will take action and try and develop what we can when we can. And that will help us sort of learn by doing in terms of what we need. But absolutely, we are keen to try and sort of standardize where possible. So it's a kind of tension that you have within all these things between trying to kind of get things standardized versus trying to kind of make some progress. And so we're kind of trying to kind of balance that out. With all of this, you know, if you look at kind of in the document, we're kind of pushing for kind of developing the capabilities that we don't already have. So, you know, we already have some interfaces for dispatch. We want to kind of build out some interfaces around kind of how we do some sort of the sort of more commercial qualification, asset registration. That's a lot of the stuff we're kind of pushing for in the short term. And then, yeah, as we kind of build out that capability, we will look to kind of align with what we're doing. So, for example, when we're building out our qualification processes, we are looking at what the ESO is doing with SMP. We're trying to kind of keep things as aligned as possible. And then as sort of things progress, we'll kind of bring things forward through probably open networks to try and kind of draw alignment. But it is often much easier to, I guess, to specify what you want and what the right standard is once you've actually had a go at doing it. And so you've got tangible experience of what worked well and what didn't, I think, you know, so that's something we're trying to kind of build into. Ben, do you want to add anything to that?
Again, I guess just recognizing that, you know, we've got some experience about what works well and what doesn't work well, but we're really keen on trying to bring in some of that experience from third parties as well, who may have insight either from, you know, adjacent industries or different countries. And so bringing that into some of the work that we're going to be taking forward through strategic partnerships is very much, you know, in our interest and a high priority for us.
Right. And then we've got a question around the requirements to participate as a marketplace or as a direct participant. So with us, we are trying to keep the requirements relatively consistent across all sort of routes to market. But, you know, we might kind of tailor the way some of those requirements are accessed depending on the provider and the scales are available. But we want people to, you know, need to be able to kind of work through the procurement process, which we're trying to keep as light as possible in terms of some initial qualification, signing some T's and C's, which we are using this sort of standard ENA common terms for. So trying to keep the contracting as light as possible. There's some work around asset qualification, which is around telling us where your assets are and us knowing that they are in the right locations. There's some work around then kind of logically grouping those assets into kind of operational units, so we know that, you know, you might have, you know, a number of assets you want to kind of pull together. And then we've got some work around sort of integrating with our more operational systems, and that's basically integrating with the flexible power portal at the moment so that you can receive dispatch signals and send metering signals. So those requirements are fairly common, and we're just looking at kind of how you do that in different ways, so as to make sure that you can access it as in a relatively simple way if you want to, so through user interfaces and stuff to kind of, if you're a direct participant, if you want to, but also trying to build ways that are also able to kind of scale, so that actually if you want to be, you know, registering thousands of domestic assets, then we've got APIs to support you doing that. So we're kind of, there's a relatively common process. We're then just looking at kind of how you might be able to do that interfacing, building on the capability of understanding that a lot of this needs to be scalable, but not trying to make it so technically, not making that the only route, so that, you know, people can kind of go at the level that is useful to them. Yeah. Now, I think that covers the questions we've got at the moment. It also kind of, we're very much at time. So I think the main bit to do now is just to thank you for your attendance. Thank you for your questions. And unsurprisingly, I'm going to hammer home again that we really do want to kind of get your feedback on what we're doing. So please do get in contact with us about what we're doing. Please do register for the workshops. We want to have some discussions. And this session has been a bit more of a, we present to you and there's some broad questions. The next sessions are very much set up as meetings. So the point is, that we'll give you a quick summary again. We'll kind of highlight the questions, and then it'll be very much over to you to come and tell us what you think about these different things. We do really want to hear from you on that. But yeah, thanks for your time.
Thanks, everyone.